It was supposed to be just another temp gig. I'd been out of work for months and jumped at the chance when the staffing agency offered me a spot as a night security guard. The pay was decent, and it wasn't like I had a ton of other options. The location was an old textile factory that had been shut down for decades, but was undergoing renovations. I was told to report at 9 p.m. sharp, and my shift would last until 5 a.m. Just watch the place and make sure no one broke in. Easy enough, right? When I arrived, the building loomed over me like a dark sentinel. The air was heavy with the smell of damp wood and rusting metal. The site manager, a gruff older man named Rick, met me at the gate. He handed me a flashlight and a set of keys and quickly walked me through the basics. "Don't wander into the basement," he said, his tone firm. "It's not safe down there. Old structure, lots of debris, you could get hurt." "Got it," I replied, though his warning seemed oddly specific. Rick left shortly after, leaving me alone with the building. I settled into the small security office near the entrance, flipping through an old logbook. It was filled with notes from previous guards, mostly mundane stuff like "all clear, quiet night," but one entry caught my eye. "Heard noises from the basement again. Didn't investigate. Too damn creepy." I shrugged it off. Every old building makes noises. It didn't mean anything. By midnight, the silence was oppressive. The kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing, your heartbeat. I decided to do a walkthrough, partly out of boredom and partly to shake the growing unease that had started gnawing at me. The factory was massive, a labyrinth of long hallways and cavernous rooms filled with abandoned machinery. My flashlight's beam barely pierced the darkness, casting strange shadows that danced and shifted with every step I took. The floor creaked beneath my boots, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I heard it, a faint scraping sound. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the building. My first thought was a rat, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I followed the noise, my heart pounding in my chest. It led me to a door I hadn't noticed before, partially hidden behind a stack of old crates. The door was slightly ajar, and a cold draft wafted through the crack. I hesitated. This had to be the basement Rick warned me about. The smart thing to do would have been to turn around, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open, and the metal hinges groaned like a wounded animal. A narrow staircase spiraled down into the pitch-black void. The air was colder here, and it carried a faint metallic tang. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing into the depths. No answer. I started down the stairs, one cautious step at a time. The scraping sound grew louder, more erratic. It reminded me of nails dragging across stone. When I reached the bottom, my flashlight flickered. I smacked it against my palm, and the light steadied, though it seemed dimmer than before. The basement was a sprawling space filled with rows of old wooden shelves, most of them empty. At the far end, I saw a figure hunched over, its back turned to me. My breath caught in my throat. It looked human, but something about its proportions was off. The arms were too long, the head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound authoritative. The figure froze, then slowly turned to face me. I wish I hadn't seen its face. Its eyes were hollow pits, black as coal, and its mouth stretched into a jagged, unnatural grin. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and it glistened as though wet. It didn't move toward me. It just stared, that horrifying grin widening as if it could sense my fear. I took a step back, and the creature tilted its head, mirroring my movement. Then, without warning, it let out a guttural scream, a sound so loud and otherworldly it felt like it rattled my bones. My flashlight died, plunging me into total darkness. I ran. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from whatever that thing was. I stumbled through the basement, crashing into shelves and tripping over debris. The scraping sound was back, but now it was accompanied by heavy, uneven footsteps. I finally found the stairs and bolted up them, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely lock it. For a moment, everything was quiet. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. Then, the banging started. It was violent, relentless, as though the thing on the other side was throwing its entire body against the door. The old wood groaned under the pressure. I didn't wait to see if it would hold. I sprinted back to the security office, grabbed my phone, and called Rick. "It's here," I whispered, my voice shaking. "There's something in the basement." Rick was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Get out. Now." I didn't need to be told twice. I ran to the exit, but the gate was locked. My hands fumbled with the keys Rick had given me, and it felt like an eternity before I found the right one. As I pushed the gate open, I glanced back at the factory. In one of the upper windows, I saw the figure again, its hollow eyes watching me. That grin, oh God, that grin, was even wider now, almost stretching ear to ear. I didn't stop running until I was safely in my car. I didn't care about the job, my paycheck, or even my dignity. I just needed to get away from that place. The next morning, I called the staffing agency and quit. I didn't explain why, and they didn't ask. A few days later, I saw a news article about the factory. The renovations had been put on hold indefinitely after a construction worker fell through the floor into the basement. They never found his body.
Story number 2.
The night I started my job at the rural hospital, I thought I knew what to expect. I'd been warned it was an old building, built in the 1920s and mostly abandoned since the 1980s, except for a small wing still in use for long-term patients. They needed someone to monitor the security cameras and make hourly rounds. Quiet job. Easy money. Or so I thought. The moment I arrived, the place gave me the creeps. It sat in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense woods. The main entrance was cracked and weathered, its grand columns chipped and stained by years of neglect. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew and antiseptic. The dim fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting flickering shadows along the endless hallways. The hospital administrator, a no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Dawson, showed me around. She didn't say much, just pointed out the security office, the staff lounge, and the limited areas I was supposed to patrol. Before leaving, she handed me a flashlight and said, almost as an afterthought, "Avoid the East Wing." "Why?" I asked, more curious than concerned. She hesitated. "It's been sealed off for decades. Structural damage. Nothing to see there." Her tone didn't invite further questions, but her unease lingered with me as she left. The first few hours were uneventful. I sat in the security office, sipping bad coffee and watching the monitors. Most showed empty hallways, save for the occasional nurse or patient shuffling by. Every so often, I'd hear distant noises, pipes groaning, wind whistling through cracks, but I chalked it up to the building's age. Around midnight, I started my rounds. The long corridors were eerily quiet, and my footsteps echoed like gunshots. The few patients I passed barely acknowledged me, their expressions blank and distant. I told myself they were just tired or heavily medicated, but something about their vacant stares unsettled me. Then I made the mistake of venturing too close to the East Wing. The entrance was blocked by a set of heavy double doors, chained and padlocked. A faded sign read, "Restricted area, do not enter." As I approached, the air grew noticeably colder. My breath misted in front of me, despite the summer heat outside. I stared at the doors, feeling an inexplicable pull, as if something or someone was on the other side, waiting. That's when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It sounded like knuckles rapping against wood, coming from deep within the East Wing. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It couldn't have been the wind. The sound was too deliberate. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the whisper. "Help me." It was faint, barely audible, but it sent a chill down my spine. My rational mind screamed at me to walk away, but my legs moved on their own. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear. The whisper came again, louder this time, tinged with desperation. "Please, help me." I fumbled with my flashlight, shining it through a small crack between the doors. The beam illuminated a narrow corridor beyond, lined with peeling wallpaper and rusted gurneys. At the far end, I saw movement, a shadow darting across the hallway. My stomach churned. "Is someone there?" I called out. No response. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't stop myself. I radioed Mrs. Dawson, but there was only static. With a deep breath, I retrieved the bolt cutters from the security office and snapped the chain. The doors groaned as I pushed them open, the hinges protesting loudly. The air inside was thick and oppressive, heavy with the stench of decay. My flashlight barely penetrated the gloom, revealing crumbling walls and debris-strewn floors. I walked cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The tapping resumed, louder now, echoing off the walls. It seemed to be coming from one of the patient rooms. I followed the sound, each step feeling like a march toward doom. The door to room 237 was ajar. The nameplate was scratched and illegible, but a faint light flickered inside. Swallowing my fear, I pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for an old hospital bed and a broken IV stand. The walls were covered in strange symbols etched into the plaster with what looked like fingernails. The light came from a single bulb swaying on a frayed cord. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as the temperature plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the whispers returned, now surrounding me. Why didn't you save us? We suffered. We're still here. I pressed my back to the wall, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. The shadows in the room began to shift, coalescing into vague, humanoid shapes. Their faces were featureless, but their pain was palpable, radiating like a physical force. One of the figures stepped forward, its hand outstretched. Its touch was icy, and a surge of images flooded my mind. Doctors in blood-stained lab coats, patients strapped to beds, screams echoing through the halls. I saw glimpses of experiments, cruel and inhuman, carried out in the name of progress. The East Wing wasn't closed for structural damage. It was a graveyard of atrocities. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear. Eventually, the shadows receded, melting into the walls. The door creaked open, and I stumbled out, gasping for air. My legs felt like jelly as I made my way back to the security office. I didn't finish my shift. I grabbed my things and drove straight home, vowing never to return. The next day, I tried to report what I'd seen, but Mrs. Dawson dismissed me. She claimed I was overworked or imagining things, but I saw the flicker of fear in her eyes. I quit that same day. Weeks later, I read an article about the hospital. A construction crew had accidentally breached the East Wing during renovations, uncovering a hidden room. Inside, they found a stack of old patient files detailing horrific experiments conducted in the 1950s. The bodies of several patients were discovered sealed behind the walls. They never identified them all. To this day, I can still hear the whispers when I close my eyes. I'll never forget their words or the cold touch of the figure in room 237. They're still there, trapped in that godforsaken hospital, waiting for someone to acknowledge their pain. And sometimes, I think they followed me.
Story number 3.
It was my first night working at the motel, a rundown place on the outskirts of town. The kind of place you only stayed at if you were desperate or running from something. I wasn't thrilled about the job, but I needed the money, and the manager, Gus, had promised me it would be quiet. Just watch the desk, he said. Take calls, check people in if they show up. Most nights, you won't even see a soul. It sounded easy enough, but from the moment I walked into the lobby, I felt uneasy. The air was stale, and the dim lighting cast long, unnatural shadows. Behind the counter, an old landline phone and a stack of dusty room keys sat next to a cracked leather guest book. The place reeked of mildew and old carpet, but there was something else, a faint metallic tang I couldn't place. Gus handed me a set of keys and left without much fanfare. "Call me if you need anything," he muttered, but his tone suggested he didn't actually want me to. By 11 p.m., I was alone. The lobby was deathly quiet, save for the occasional groan of the ancient air conditioning unit. I passed the time flipping through an old magazine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I chalked it up to nerves. New job, creepy setting. It was natural to feel on edge. Then the phone rang. The sound startled me so badly I nearly dropped the magazine. I glanced at the clock. 12:07 a.m. Who would be calling at this hour? I hesitated before picking up the receiver. "Front desk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, I heard a woman's voice. "Room 205, she whispered. Her tone was shaky, almost pleading. "Please, help me." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding. "Room 205, I checked the guest book. No one was listed as staying there. In fact, the last entry for room 205 was dated 5 years ago. I debated calling Gus, but decided against it. He'd probably just laugh and tell me I was imagining things. Instead, I grabbed the master key and headed down the dimly lit hallway. The motel had a strange layout. The rooms were spread across 2 floors in a horseshoe shape, with room 205 at the far end of the second floor. As I climbed the stairs, the temperature seemed to drop. By the time I reached the door to 205, I could see my breath. The air felt heavy, oppressive. I knocked once, twice, but there was no answer. "Hello?" I called out. "Is anyone in there?" No response. I hesitated, then unlocked the door. The room was dark, the only light coming from the flickering neon sign outside the window. It was a standard motel room, bed, nightstand, TV, but everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if no one had stepped foot inside for years. The air smelled faintly of rot. I was about to leave when I noticed something odd. The closet door was slightly ajar. A faint scratching sound came from within. "Hello?" I said again, my voice barely above a whisper. The scratching stopped. I approached the closet, my pulse hammering in my ears. With trembling hands, I pulled the door open. Inside was nothing. Just an empty space filled with old hangers and shadows. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling foolish. Then I heard it. A soft, wet drip, drip, drip. I turned toward the bathroom. The door was closed, but a thin line of light seeped out from underneath. The dripping sound grew louder, more insistent. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my legs carried me forward. I pushed the bathroom door open and froze. The bathtub was filled with murky, dark water. Something was floating just beneath the surface. A figure, pale and motionless. A woman. Her hair fanned out around her like seaweed, and her eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. Then she moved. Her head jerked toward me, and her lips twisted into a grotesque smile. Water spilled from her mouth as she croaked. "You shouldn't be here." I stumbled backward, tripping over the doorframe and falling hard onto the carpet. When I looked up, the bathroom was empty. No water, no woman. Just an old, cracked tub. I scrambled to my feet and bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock it. As I hurried back to the lobby, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I didn't dare turn around. When I reached the front desk, the phone was ringing again. I stared at it, my mind racing. Finally, I picked it up. "Room 205, the same woman's voice whispered. "You didn't help me." The line went dead. I was done. I grabbed my bag and ran out to my car, not bothering to lock up. As I sped away from the motel, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The neon sign flickered, casting strange, erratic shadows, and in one of the second-story windows, I saw her, the woman from the bathtub. Her hollow eyes followed me as I drove into the night. The next day, I quit over the phone. Gus didn't seem surprised. "Happens to a lot of new hires," he said, almost casually. When I pressed him, he admitted the motel had a history. "A woman was killed there years ago," he said. "Room 205, never solved. People say she never left. I've tried to put it behind me, but I still have nightmares. Sometimes I wake up to the sound of a phone ringing, and sometimes, late at night, I think I hear her voice, whispering from the shadows. You didn't help me."
Story number 4.
My first day at the antique shop was supposed to be simple. I'd answered a help wanted ad that promised flexible hours and decent pay. The shop was small, tucked away in a quiet part of town, the kind of place you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. Its faded sign read, "Curio & Co. Antiques." The owner, an older man named Mr. Grayson, seemed nice enough. He was soft-spoken and wore round glasses that made him look like a character from a storybook. He gave me a quick tour, pointing out the layout of the shop. Rows of shelves crammed with dusty trinkets, glass cases filled with delicate porcelain, and a back room where unsorted items were stored. "Most nights are quiet," he said, handing me a set of keys. "You'll be closing up on your own. Just make sure everything's locked, and don't let anyone into the back room." I nodded, not thinking much of it. The place seemed harmless, though it had an odd smell, like old wood and something faintly metallic. My shift started at 6 p.m. and ended at midnight. Mr. Grayson left around 7, leaving me to man the shop alone. The first few hours passed uneventfully. A couple of customers wandered in, browsing the shelves, but no one bought anything. By 9 p.m., the streets outside were deserted, and the shop was silent, except for the faint ticking of the antique clocks on display. I was dusting a shelf near the back when I heard it, a soft thump like something falling. I froze, listening. Another thump followed, this one louder, coming from the back room. I remembered Mr. Grayson's warning, "Don't let anyone into the back room." But he hadn't said anything about going in myself. Grabbing a flashlight from the counter, I made my way to the door. It was slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd seen Mr. Grayson lock it before he left. I hesitated, then pushed it open. The room was larger than I expected, cluttered with boxes, old furniture, and strange, mismatched items. The air was colder here, and the metallic smell was stronger. My flashlight beam swept across the room, landing on a tall, ornate mirror propped against the wall. The mirror was unlike anything I'd seen before. Its frame was intricately carved, depicting twisting vines and grotesque faces. The glass itself was cloudy, almost liquid-looking, as if it were rippling slightly. As I stepped closer, I saw something in the reflection. Movement. But when I turned around, the room was empty. My pulse quickened. I faced the mirror again, and this time I saw a figure. It was a woman, standing just behind me, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, and her mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. I spun around, but there was no one there. The mirror rattled and a faint whisper filled the room. I couldn't make out the words, but the voice was soft, almost mournful. I backed away, my hands shaking. As I did, the whisper grew louder, the words becoming clearer. "Let me out." I stumbled out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My heart was racing, and my breath came in short gasps. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just an old mirror playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Back at the counter, I tried to focus on my work, but the shop felt different. The air was heavier, and the shadows seemed darker, deeper. The ticking of the clocks grew louder, almost deafening, until I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to lock up early. As I was about to turn off the lights, the phone rang. The sound was sharp and jarring in the silence. I picked up, my hand trembling. "Hello?" At first, there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, a voice. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The line went dead. I dropped the phone and bolted for the door. As I fumbled with the keys, I heard a soft creak behind me. I turned, and my blood ran cold. The woman from the mirror was standing in the middle of the shop. Her head was tilted at that same unnatural angle, and her unblinking eyes locked onto mine. She took a step toward me, her movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was pleading with. She raised a hand, and the lights flickered. The shadows seemed to come alive, writhing and twisting around her. The clock stopped ticking all at once, the sudden silence more terrifying than the noise. Then she spoke. "You let me out." The lights went out completely, plunging the shop into darkness. I felt a cold hand brush against my arm, and I screamed, fumbling for the door. Somehow, I managed to unlock it and stumbled outside, gasping for air. When I looked back, the shop was dark, the windows empty. But in the faint reflection of the glass, I saw her, standing inside, watching me with that horrible grin. I didn't go back the next day. I called Mr. Grayson and quit over the phone, making some excuse about finding another job. He didn't argue, just sighed heavily and said, "It happens more often than you'd think." A few weeks later, I drove past the shop out of morbid curiosity. The sign was gone, and the windows were boarded up. A for lease sign hung crookedly on the door. I've tried to forget what happened, but every now and then, I catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a pale figure, a crooked grin, and at night, when the house is quiet, I sometimes hear a soft whisper, "Let me out."
Story number 5.
It was my first day working the graveyard shift at a 24-hour gas station just off the interstate. The place wasn't much, just a small shop, a couple of pumps, and a flickering neon sign that read, "Open all night." It had the kind of vibe you'd see in a low-budget horror movie, but the manager promised double pay for night shifts, and I was broke. "Nothing happens here," he'd said, slapping me on the shoulder as he handed me the keys. "You'll be bored out of your mind." Bored didn't seem so bad. The first few hours were slow. A trucker stopped by for coffee and cigarettes, and a teenager bought a pack of gum before disappearing into the night. By midnight, the place was silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional drone of a car speeding past on the highway. I was leaning on the counter, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed something on the security monitor. One of the pumps, the farthest one from the building, was active. The nozzle was out, and the screen showed it was dispensing gas, but no car was there. I frowned, leaning closer to the monitor. The feed was grainy and in black and white, but it was clear. The pump handle was hovering in midair, as if held by invisible hands. Thinking it was some kind of glitch, I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside. The air was thick and cold, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones. I walked to the pump, shining my flashlight around, but there was no one there. The nozzle dangled, swaying slightly, though there wasn't a breeze. I reached out to grab it, and the moment my fingers touched the metal, I felt it. A sharp, electric jolt, like static shock, but 10 times worse. I yanked my hand back, stumbling a few steps. The pump beeped and stopped dispensing. The screen went dark. Shaking my head, I replaced the nozzle and hurried back inside. Faulty equipment, I muttered to myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The hours dragged on and the unease grew. Around 2 a.m., the phone rang. The sudden sound made me jump, and it took me a moment to pick up. "Hello?" I said, my voice shaky. At first, there was only static. Then, faintly, a voice. "He's coming." "What? Who's coming?" I asked, but the line went dead. I stared at the receiver, my heart pounding. I tried calling the manager, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I told myself it was a prank, some bored kid trying to mess with the new guy. But then the lights started flickering. At first, it was just the overhead fluorescence, buzzing and dimming. Then the coffee machine clicked on and off, spilling a steaming stream onto the counter. The radio behind the counter crackled to life, spitting out distorted voices and faint screams. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. And then I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the parking lot, just beyond the reach of the lights, tall and thin, with long arms that hung unnaturally at his sides. His face was pale and smooth, like it had been stretched tight over a skull. He didn't move, didn't step into the light. He just stood there, watching. "Who the hell are you?" I shouted, though my voice cracked with fear. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised one of those impossibly long arms and pointed at the shop. At me. The phone rang again. I turned to look at it, and when I glanced back, the man was gone. My chest heaved as I grabbed the receiver. "Hello?" This time, the voice was clearer. It was a woman, her tone urgent and filled with panic. "Don't let him in." The line went dead again. The lights in the shop cut out completely, plunging the room into darkness. My flashlight barely worked, the beam flickering weakly as I shined it toward the windows. Outside, the man was closer now, like standing just beyond the glass. His head tilted at an unnatural angle, and I swear I could hear the creak of bone as he moved. The door rattled. I froze. The lock on the door was old, just a flimsy latch that wouldn't hold against a strong push. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a broom, and backed away. The door rattled again, harder this time. The man leaned forward, pressing his face against the glass. His eyes, or the dark pits where his eyes should have been, locked onto mine. His mouth stretched into a wide, toothless grin. "Stay away," I shouted, brandishing the broom like it was a sword. The glass cracked, just a hairline fracture, but enough to make my stomach drop. He pressed harder, his grin widening as the crack spread. I bolted for the back room, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands fumbled with my phone as I tried to call 911, but the screen stayed black, refusing to turn on. The air in the back room was freezing, and I could see my breath in the faint light. Shelves of supplies loomed like shadows, and the faint metallic smell I'd noticed earlier was stronger here, almost suffocating. Then I heard the whispering. It came from all around me, soft and insistent. Words I couldn't understand, spoken in a language that made my skin crawl. The shadows in the room seemed to move, shifting and stretching like they were alive. The door behind me creaked, and I turned just in time to see it slowly swing open. He was there, standing in the doorway, his head tilted so far it was nearly upside down. His arms reached toward me, long fingers grasping at the air. I stumbled back, knocking over a shelf. Cans and boxes clattered to the floor as I scrambled for the rear exit. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as I threw open the door and ran into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached the diner down the road. The waitress gave me a strange look as I burst through the door, out of breath and wide-eyed. "Are you okay?" she asked, but I couldn't answer. I just shook my head and collapsed into a booth. The gas station was empty the next morning when the police went to investigate. No sign of the man, or the cracked glass, or anything out of the ordinary. The cameras had stopped recording at midnight, and the manager insisted I must have imagined it all. But I know what I saw. And every now and then, when I'm driving late at night, I think I see him standing by the side of the road, his head tilted, his hand raised to point.
Story number 6.
It was my first day as an overnight security guard at an abandoned psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town. The building had been closed for decades, a relic from an era when the mentally ill were hidden away rather than treated. Local kids told ghost stories about it. Tales of patients who never left, of doctors who performed terrible experiments, and of screams that echoed through the halls at night. I didn't believe in any of that. To me, it was just a job. The pay was good, and all I had to do was make hourly rounds and keep vandals out. "Don't let the stories get to you," the supervisor had said during orientation. "And if you hear anything strange, just ignore it. These old buildings creak like crazy." The hospital was massive, a hulking structure of decaying brick and shattered windows. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of mold and something faintly metallic. The halls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and rusted wheelchairs sat abandoned in corners, their wheels frozen in place by time. I started my shift at 10 p.m., stationed in a small office near the entrance. There were cameras covering the main corridors, though half of them were either broken or too blurry to be useful. The first round of checks was uneventful, just empty halls and the distant sound of dripping water. By midnight, I was starting to feel the weight of the silence. The building was oppressively quiet, the kind of quiet that made your ears strain for any sound, no matter how small. I told myself I was being paranoid, but then I heard it, the faint echo of footsteps. At first, I thought it might be another guard or maybe a homeless person who'd found their way inside. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the source, down a long, dark corridor that led to the east wing. My footsteps echoed in time with the faint sound ahead, and I called out, "Hello? This is private property. You need to leave." No response. The air grew colder as I walked, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker. I stopped in front of a door marked Ward C. The paint was chipped, and deep scratches marred the wood, as if someone or something had clawed at it. The footsteps had stopped, but I could feel a presence, something heavy and oppressive, pressing against me. Pushing the door open, I shone my flashlight inside. The room was empty, except for rows of old beds with rusted frames and decaying mattresses. I stepped inside, the beam of my light cutting through the darkness, and then I saw it, movement at the far end of the room. "Hey!" I called, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It was hunched over, facing the corner, its shoulders jerking as if it were laughing silently. My stomach churned, and I tightened my grip on the flashlight. "Sir? Ma'am, you're trespassing. I need you to leave." Slowly, the figure straightened. It turned to face me, and my blood ran cold. It wasn't a person. Its face was pale and distorted, the features smeared as if melted. Its eyes were hollow pits, black and endless, and its mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It took a step toward me, and the sound of its bare feet scraping against the floor made me gag. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, and bolted out of the room. My heart pounded as I ran down the hall, the faint sound of laughter echoing behind me. Back in the office, I locked the door and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking as I reached for the phone to call my supervisor. But when I picked it up, there was no dial tone, just static. Then, through the crackling, I heard a voice. It was faint, a whisper that made my skin crawl. "You can't leave." I slammed the receiver down, my breathing ragged. The cameras on the monitors flickered, the images distorting. On one screen, I saw the figure from the ward standing in the middle of the hallway, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. It raised an arm pointing directly at the camera, and then the screen went black. The lights in the office flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from my flashlight. My gut told me to leave, to run and never look back at, but the supervisor had locked the main doors behind me, and the keys were in the office safe. I fumbled with the combination, my hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get it open. As I grabbed the keys, I heard it again, the laughter. Soft at first, but growing louder, closer. I turned toward the door, and through the frosted glass, I saw a shadow. It was tall, its limbs elongated and grotesque, and it stood perfectly still, waiting. I backed away, clutching the keys like a lifeline. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so thick it felt like a physical weight. Then, the door handle began to turn. I didn't wait to see what would happen. I bolted out of the office through the side door, running blindly down the hall. The building seemed to shift around me, the layout twisting and unfamiliar. I passed rooms that hadn't been there before, rooms filled with flickering lights, blood-stained walls, and shadowy figures that watched me as I ran. Finally, I found the main doors. My hands were trembling so violently I almost dropped the keys as I unlocked them. The door creaked open, and I stumbled outside, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. As I fumbled with the ignition, I glanced back at the building. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw it, the figure staring down at me, its head still tilted, its grin wider than ever. The next morning, I quit the job over the phone. The supervisor didn't seem surprised. "You made it longer than most," he said. When I asked him what was wrong with the place, he sighed. "Some things are better left buried." I haven't been back since, but sometimes late at night, I dream of that building. I see the dark halls, the empty wards, and the figure with the hollow eyes. And in the silence of my room, I hear the laughter, soft and distant, reminding me that some doors should never be opened.
Story number 7.
My first night as a live-in caretaker for the Grayson estate was supposed to be quiet. The sprawling Victorian mansion sat on the edge of a dense forest, its nearest neighbor miles away. The family had moved out years ago, leaving it in my care while they decided what to do with the property. They warned me it was old, creaky, and prone to electrical issues, but they failed to mention the other things. When I arrived just before sunset, the house loomed against the sky like something out of a Gothic novel. Its paint was peeling and several windows were boarded up. The ornate iron gate creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing across the empty yard. I parked my car and grabbed my bag, feeling a chill as I approached the front door. The key turned easily in the lock, and the door swung open with a groan. The air inside was stale, tinged with mildew and something faintly metallic. The grand staircase dominated the entryway, its banister carved with intricate patterns of vines and flowers. Dust motes floated in the fading light streaming through the stained glass windows. I set my bag down and made a quick tour of the house. The kitchen was outdated but functional. The living room was cluttered with antique furniture, and the bedrooms upstairs were eerily pristine, as if someone had just walked out of them yesterday. The only room that felt wrong was the study. It was at the end of a long hallway on the second floor. The heavy wooden door was locked, and no key on the ring I'd been given would open it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stood there, staring at the door. A faint smell of burnt wood wafted through the crack beneath it, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt an overwhelming urge to walk away. As night fell, the house seemed to come alive. The creaks and groans of the old wood echoed through the halls, and the wind howled against the windows. I told myself it was normal, just the sounds of an old house settling. But by midnight, the noises became harder to ignore. I was lying in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and coming from upstairs. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. The footsteps moved down the hallway, stopping right outside my door. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. Silence. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and crept to the door. My hand trembled as I turned the knob and pulled it open, shining the beam into the hallway. It was empty. The footsteps started again, this time behind me. I spun around, the light sweeping the room, but nothing was there. My breath came in short gasps as I backed into the hallway, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The house was silent now, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, like I was being watched. I decided to check the study. Something about the locked door gnawed at me, a compulsion I couldn't explain. I made my way down the hallway, my footsteps muffled on the dusty carpet. When I reached the door, I noticed something I hadn't before, a faint scorch mark near the handle, as if it had been burned. I tried the knob again, but it wouldn't budge. Desperation mounting, I kicked the door, and the old wood splintered under the force. The smell of burnt wood hit me like a wall as the door swung open. The room was empty, except for a single chair in the center, facing a large, cracked mirror. The walls were covered in strange, jagged symbols carved deep into the wood. The air was colder here, and my flashlight flickered as I stepped inside. I approached the chair cautiously, my pulse racing. The mirror was cloudy, its surface smeared with something dark. As I stared into it, the reflection seemed wrong. It showed the room as it was, but there was something else, a shadow standing just behind me. I whipped around, but nothing was there. When I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was gone. Instead, words appeared, scrawled across the surface in what looked like ash. "Help me." A sudden crash echoed from downstairs, and I nearly dropped the flashlight. I ran out of the study, slamming the door behind me, and bolted down the stairs. In the living room, a large portrait that had hung above the fireplace lay shattered on the floor. The glass was broken, and the frame was splintered. The room felt colder, and I could see my breath as I stood there, frozen. Then I heard the whispering. It started softly, barely audible like wind through the trees. But it grew louder, more insistent, coming from all around me. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading, desperate. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty house. The whispering stopped. For a moment, the silence was suffocating. Then, from somewhere upstairs, I heard a voice, faint and trembling, but unmistakably human. "Help me." The voice sent chills down my spine. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I found myself climbing the stairs. The voice grew louder as I approached the study, now sobbing and incoherent. The door was closed, but the scorch marks had spread, dark streaks spidering across the wood. I reached for the handle, and the moment my fingers touched it, a searing pain shot up my arm. I yanked my hand back, staring at the red mark burned into my skin. The sobbing turned into a scream, high-pitched and unrelenting, as if someone were being torn apart. The door burst open on its own, slamming against the wall. The chair in the center of the room was now occupied. A woman sat there, her back to me. Her hair was matted and hung in tangled clumps, and her hands clutched the arms of the chair with white-knuckled intensity. She turned her head, slowly, unnaturally, until I could see her face. Her eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck the light from the room. Her mouth stretched open, far wider than it should have, and the scream that erupted from her filled my ears, drowning out everything else. I ran. I don't remember how I got out of the house or back to my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. As I sped down the dark, winding road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The woman was sitting in the back seat, her hollow eyes locked on mine. I swerved, nearly crashing into a tree, and when I looked again, she was gone. But I could still hear her scream, faint and distant, like an echo that would never fade. I never went back to the Grayson estate. The family contacted me a few days later, asking why I'd abandoned the job. I didn't bother explaining. Some things are better left unsaid. But at night, when I'm alone, I sometimes see her in the corner of my room, her hollow eyes watching, her scream ringing in my ears. And no matter how far I run, I know she'll always follow.
Story number 8.
It was supposed to be a routine night shift. I'd been hired as a cleaner for the graveyard shift at a small-town hotel, a sprawling old building with creaky floors and drafty hallways. The pay wasn't great, but the hours worked for me. I figured I'd be mopping floors and wiping down surfaces while the guests slept. Nothing out of the ordinary. I couldn't have been more wrong. The hotel, known as the Rosewood Inn, had a storied history. Built in the late 1800s, it was said to have hosted famous guests, survived a fire, and even been the scene of a tragic murder. Locals whispered that it was haunted, but I wasn't the superstitious type. Ghosts were just stories, I thought. I arrived at 11 p.m., greeted by the night manager, a wiry man named Mark. He handed me a ring of keys and a clipboard with my cleaning checklist. "Stay out of room 308, he said abruptly, his face unusually serious. "Why?" I asked, curious but unbothered. "It's just policy," he replied, avoiding my eyes. "You don't need to clean it. Just leave it alone." His tone was unsettling, but I shrugged it off. There were plenty of other rooms to deal with, and I wasn't going to waste time worrying about one I didn't have to touch. The first couple of hours passed uneventfully. The hotel was eerily quiet, with only the hum of the vending machines and the occasional creak of the old building keeping me company. Most of the guests were already asleep, and the halls felt deserted. At around 1 a.m., I made my way to the third floor. The air felt heavier there, colder. The hallway lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. My clipboard said room 306 needed fresh towels, so I grabbed a stack from my cart and headed that way. As I approached, I noticed room 308. The door stood out. Unlike the others, which were plain and unassuming, this door looked darker, almost as if it absorbed the light around it. The number plaque was tarnished, and deep scratches marred the wood, as if someone had clawed at it. Ignoring the odd sensation creeping up my spine, I knocked on 306. No answer. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, quickly replacing the towels and straightening the bathroom. As I turned to leave, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. It wasn't coming from 306. It was coming from 308. I froze, my pulse quickening. It was probably nothing, I told myself, maybe just the building settling. But the sound continued, steady and deliberate, like someone knocking slowly, persistently. I tried to ignore it, returning to my cart and moving on to the next task, but the tapping stayed with me, echoing in my ears. By 2 a.m., I was cleaning the lobby, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing toward the security cameras mounted in the corners, half expecting to see something or someone lurking in the shadows. The monitors at the front desk showed a view of the hallways, including the third floor. One screen in particular caught my attention, room 308. The feed was static-filled, but I could just make out the door. As I stared, the faint outline of a figure appeared in front of it. My heart skipped a beat. The figure was still, standing unnaturally straight. Then, slowly, it turned toward the camera. I looked away, blinking rapidly, and when I glanced back, the figure was gone. The logical part of my brain told me it was just a glitch, a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest. By 3 a.m., I was back on the third floor, collecting trash from the guest rooms. The hallway felt colder now, and the faint smell of burnt wood lingered in the air. As I passed room 308, I heard it again, the tapping. Only this time it was louder, sharper, like nails rapping against the wood. I should have walked away. I should have listened to Mark's warning, but something drew me to that door. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something darker. I stood in front of room 308, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The tapping stopped, replaced by silence so it felt like a physical weight. I knocked softly, half hoping no one would answer. The door creaked open on its own. The room beyond was dark, but not the kind of darkness you find in an unlit space. It was deeper, suffocating, as if the light itself had been swallowed. The air was freezing, and I could see my breath in front of me. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind me. The room was empty, but the shadows felt alive, shifting and twisting in the corners. My flashlight flickered as I shone it around the room, revealing faded wallpaper and a bed that looked untouched for years. Then I saw it, the mirror on the wall. It was large, ornate, and covered in a thin layer of grime. But even through the dirt, I could see movement, something shifting in the reflection. My heart raced as I stepped closer, the beam of my flashlight trembling. The reflection didn't match the room. It showed the same furniture, the same bed, but there was something else, a figure standing in the far corner. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long, and its head tilted at an impossible angle. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unrelenting. I spun around, pointing the flashlight at the corner. Nothing. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer. "Get out," a voice whispered, so faint I wasn't sure I'd heard it. The figure in the mirror took a step closer, its movements jerky, unnatural. "Get out now." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted for the door, yanking it open and stumbling into the hallway. The air was thick, heavy, and the shadows seemed to reach for me as I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the lobby, my chest heaving, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. Mark was waiting at the front desk, his expression grim. "You went into 308, didn't you?" I nodded, unable to speak. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "That room, it's where she died. The guest, back in the 50s. She was staying here alone, and no one knows what happened, but they found her, in the mirror, like she'd been pulled in." I stared at him, my mouth dry. "Why didn't you tell me? Would you have believed me?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Most don't. I quit that night." Mark didn't seem surprised. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror, like half expecting to see her distorted face, her empty eyes, but the road was empty. Still, every time I pass a mirror, I can't help but look twice, searching the reflection for something that doesn't belong. Because once you've seen her, you never really stop feeling her presence. And no matter how far you run, you know she's watching, waiting for the moment when you let your guard down.
Story number 9.
It started with an ad. Night watchman wanted, no experience necessary, immediate start. The pay was decent and the hours fit perfectly with my schedule. The location was an abandoned factory on the edge of town, a hulking, decaying structure that had been out of commission for decades. It sounded simple enough. Sit in a booth, watch the cameras, and make sure no one broke in. When I showed up for my first shift, I was greeted by an older man named Tom, who looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes darted nervously, and he barely met my gaze as he handed me a flashlight and a walkie-talkie. "Just stick to the main office," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't go wandering. And whatever you do, if you hear knocking, don't answer." Before I could ask him what he meant, he was gone, leaving me alone in the crumbling factory. The office was a small, dimly lit room with a single desk, a few monitors, and a chair that looked like it had seen better days. The monitors displayed grainy black and white footage from various parts of the factory. The loading docks, the main floor, the storage rooms, and a long, shadowy hallway labeled West Wing. The first few hours passed uneventfully. The factory was dead silent, except for the occasional groan of the old pipes and the faint hum of the monitors. I spent most of the time scrolling through my phone and sipping coffee, trying to keep myself awake. Around 2 a.m., the temperature dropped sharply. The air in the office grew heavy, and the faint smell of rust and mildew became overpowering. I glanced at the monitors, my heart skipping a beat when I noticed movement on the West Wing camera. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the light. It was tall, its silhouette unnaturally thin, and it didn't move. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen, but the grainy footage made it impossible to make out any details. Probably just a shadow, I muttered to myself, though I didn't quite believe it. The figure remained still for several minutes before suddenly disappearing. One moment it was there, and the next the hallway was empty. I scanned the other cameras, but there was no sign of it. That was when the knocking started. It was soft at first, coming from somewhere outside the office. A slow, deliberate tap, 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 like someone rapping their knuckles against metal. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and it was coming closer. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The knocking stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was almost worse. I grabbed the flashlight and hesitated, staring at the office door. My rational mind told me it was probably a raccoon or some other animal, but the knot in my stomach said otherwise. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating peeling paint and rust-streaked walls. The air was frigid, and my breath came out in white puffs. The knocking had stopped, but the oppressive silence made every step feel like a mistake. As I turned the corner, I saw it, a handprint on the wall. It was smeared, long fingers streaked in what looked like black ash. The sight made my stomach churn, but I pressed on, determined to figure out what was going on. The sound of footsteps behind me made me whirl around, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The hallway was empty, but the faint echo of steps lingered, as if someone had just been there. I decided I'd had enough. I turned to head back to the office, but the hallway stretched on longer than I remembered. The walls seemed to close in, and the faint smell of smoke filled the air. My heart pounded as I realized I was no longer sure which direction I'd come from. Then I heard the whispering. It was faint at first, like a breeze rustling through leaves, but as I stood frozen, it grew louder, filling the hallway with a chorus of voices. They spoke in low, urgent tones, overlapping and indecipherable, but the tone was clear, pleading, desperate. "Stop it," I shouted, my voice cracking. The whispering ceased instantly, replaced by a deafening silence. And then, from the shadows at the far end of the hallway, something moved. It stepped into the beam of my flashlight, and I felt my knees go weak. It was the figure from the camera, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long and twisted. Its face was pale and featureless, save for two deep, empty sockets where eyes should have been. It tilted its head as if studying me, before taking a slow, deliberate step forward. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering wildly, and that's when I noticed the other shapes emerging from the shadows. Dozens of them, all pale and misshapen, their hollow eyes fixed on me. The whispering started again, louder this time, filling my ears and drowning out my thoughts. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move, running blindly down the hallway. I don't know how I found the office, but I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The monitors flickered violently, static consuming the screens before they cut to black. The knocking started again, louder than before, coming from all sides of the office. It was frantic now, as if dozens of fists were pounding against the walls. I clutched the walkie-talkie, my hands shaking, and radioed for help. "Tom, are you there? I need help. Something's in here with me." The walkie crackled with static before his voice came through, barely audible. "I told you, don't answer the knocking. Don't let them in." The walkie went dead, and I realized the knocking had stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, and I held my breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. The door to the office creaked open. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, it was daylight, and I was sitting in my car, parked on the side of the road. My flashlight and the walkie-talkie were gone, and my clothes were damp with sweat. I don't even remember driving there. I quit the job that morning, ignoring the dozen missed calls from the company. I didn't care about the paycheck. Whatever was in that factory, I wanted nothing to do with it. It's been months, but I still can't shake the feeling that I brought something back with me. At night, I hear faint knocking on the walls of my apartment, and sometimes in the reflection of my bathroom mirror, I see them, those hollow eyes staring back at me.
Story number 10.
It was my first day at the old factory, tucked away in a desolate corner of town. They called it a job opportunity, but as I stepped through the rusted gates, a chill ran down my spine. The air was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the distant hum of machinery. I tightened my grip on the application letter, hoping this job would be the fresh start I desperately needed. Inside, the corridors stretched like dark veins lined with flickering fluorescent lights that cast unsettling shadows. The supervisor, Mr. Thompson, greeted me with a terse nod, his eyes sunken and weary. He led me through labyrinthine passages to my workstation, a dimly lit room stacked with dusty files and ancient computers. The air smelled of dampness and decay, a stark contrast to the sterile office environments I'd known before. As I settled in, Mr. Thompson muttered something about the night shift being short-staffed. I nodded, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my gut. The hours passed slowly, punctuated by the occasional clank and groan of machinery in the bowels of the factory. Each sound echoed through the empty halls like a distant cry, sending shivers down my spine. Around midnight, things took a turn. I was poring over spreadsheets when a loud crash echoed from the maintenance wing. Startled, I glanced at Mr. Thompson, but he seemed unfazed, lost in his own world of paperwork. With trembling hands, I ventured into the labyrinth of corridors, my footsteps echoing eerily. The maintenance wing was a maze of pipes and machinery, illuminated by a single flickering bulb. Shadows danced along the walls, playing tricks on my mind. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw it, a figure darting behind a row of ancient boilers. My heart raced as I called out, but there was no reply, only the echo of my own voice, fading into the darkness. I stumbled back to my workstation, shaken to the core. Mr. Thompson glanced up briefly, his expression unreadable. "Just the night playing tricks on you," he muttered, his voice hollow. But I knew what I had seen, or thought I had seen. The rest of the shift passed in a haze of paranoia, each creak and groan of the factory machinery intensifying my unease. As dawn broke, I staggered out of the factory, my mind racing with unanswered questions. Was it a trick of the light, or something more sinister lurking in the shadows? I tried to dismiss it as exhaustion, but the memory lingered like a lingering fog. Weeks passed and I settled into a monotonous routine, trying to push the incident to the back of my mind. But the factory seemed different now, a living, breathing entity with a mind of its own. Co-workers spoke in hushed tones of strange occurrences, the flickering lights, the unexplained drafts, the eerie footsteps echoing in deserted hallways. One night, curiosity got the better of me. Unable to sleep, I wandered into the archives, where stacks of old records gathered dust like forgotten memories. Among them, I found a faded newspaper clipping dated decades ago, a story of a tragic accident that claimed the lives of several workers in the very factory I now called home. According to the article, the accident had been hushed up, blamed on faulty equipment and human error. But rumors persisted of something darker, an entity that lurked in the shadows, feeding on the fear of those who dared to enter its domain. The factory, it seemed, had a history stained with blood and secrets buried deep within its walls. That night, as I patrolled the deserted corridors, I felt eyes watching me from the darkness. A cold wind whispered through the halls, carrying with it a chilling presence that sent shivers down my spine. And then I saw it. A fleeting glimpse of a figure, shrouded in darkness, its eyes burning like embers in the night. I stumbled backwards, my pulse racing as adrenaline surged through my veins. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. But there was no response, only the echo of my own fear reverberating through the empty halls. From that moment on, I knew I was not alone. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord. Whispers echoed through the corridors when no one was there. Mr. Thompson, once stoic and indifferent, grew increasingly withdrawn, his eyes haunted by unseen terrors. Co-workers avoided certain sections of the factory, muttering about strange noises and unexplained sightings. I tried to find solace in logic, to rationalize the inexplicable. But the more I delved into the factory's history, the more I realized that some mysteries defy explanation. It was as if the factory itself had a life of its own, a malevolent force that preyed on the unsuspecting souls who dared to venture too close. One fateful night, as I worked late into the witching hour, I heard a voice, a soft, mournful whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Help me," it pleaded, barely audible above the hum of machinery. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I searched frantically for the source of the voice. And then I saw her, a young woman, her ghostly figure translucent in the dim light. Her eyes were filled with an otherworldly sadness, her voice a haunting echo of a life cut short. She reached out to me, her hand trembling as if grasping for salvation from the depths of the factory's dark past. I wanted to run, to flee from the spectral apparition that defied reason and logic. But something held me captive, a sense of duty, perhaps, or a curiosity born of fear. "What happened to you?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. Her story unfolded like a tragic tale from another era, a tale of greed and betrayal, of lives sacrificed in the relentless pursuit of profit. She had been a worker, like me, drawn into the factory's web of deceit and darkness. And when she had stumbled upon the truth, she had paid the ultimate price, a life snuffed out, her spirit condemned to wander the corridors for eternity. Tears welled in her eyes as she spoke of unfinished business, of a restless soul seeking redemption. "Help me," she implored once more, her voice fading into the shadows, and then she was gone, leaving behind an empty silence that reverberated through the night. I stumbled out of the factory, my mind reeling with the weight of what I had witnessed. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred beyond recognition, leaving me adrift in a sea of uncertainty. How could I explain what I had seen, what I had felt in the depths of that haunted place? Days turned into weeks, and I found myself drawn back to the factory, compelled by a sense of unfinished business. I sought answers in forgotten records and whispered legends, piecing together fragments of a puzzle that spanned generations. The factory's dark past began to unravel before me, a tapestry of suffering and sorrow woven into the fabric of its crumbling walls. And then, one stormy night, the truth revealed itself in a torrent of fury. As I delved deeper into the archives, I uncovered damning evidence of negligence and corruption, a trail of lies that led straight to the heart of the factory's darkest secret. The accidents, the disappearances, they had not been accidents at all, but a sinister cover-up orchestrated to protect the guilty and silence the innocent. Armed with newfound knowledge, I confronted Mr. Thompson, demanding answers that he could no longer evade. His facade crumbled, revealing a man haunted by guilt and complicity, a cog in the machine of a malevolent force that had claimed so many lives. But the factory had one final revelation in store for me, a truth more chilling than anything I could have imagined. In the depths of the labyrinth, where darkness held sway and echoes whispered of forgotten souls, I came face to face with the entity that had tormented us all, an ancient spirit bound to the factory's legacy of suffering. Its eyes blazed with a fury born of centuries of confinement, its presence a palpable force that sent shockwaves through my very being. "Leave this place," it rasped, its voice a spectral echo that reverberated through the walls. "You have uncovered what should remain hidden." I stood my ground, trembling but defiant, fueled by a newfound resolve born of justice and truth. "No more," I whispered, my voice echoing through the darkness. "The truth will be known." And with that, the ancient spirit retreated, its malevolent presence dissipating like smoke in the wind. The factory fell silent, the echoes of its haunted past fading into the annals of history. As dawn broke over the horizon, I walked away from the factory for the final time, my heart heavy with the weight of what I had witnessed. The scars of that night would forever linger, a testament to the horrors that lurked in the shadows of the human soul. But somewhere, amidst the ruins of that haunted place, a sense of peace settled over me, a peace born of justice served and spirits laid to rest. The factory stood silent and empty, its dark secrets exposed to the light of day. And in the quiet stillness of that moment, I knew that I had survived, not just the first day on the job, but a trial by fire that had tested my courage and resolve. The factory's legacy would haunt me forever, a reminder of the fragility of life and the depths of human darkness.